Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation titled Carver plus Shock Method for Assessing Vulnerabilities in Food Security. My name is Corey Hahn, and this presentation was made for the Vulnerability and Protection course at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The first step for conducting the Carver plus Shock analysis was to establish the parameters. These parameters were identified by asking the following questions, which are bolded on the slide. First, what is the food supply chain being assessed? For this analysis, I decided to analyze wheat production from farm to table, with a special focus on the processing and storing of grain at elevator facilities, also known as grain elevators. The next question is, what are the primary concerns? In short, the highest concerns are mass sickness and substantial economic losses that could result from agritourism. This leads into the next question related to the type of attack and the attacker's profile. For this analysis, I assumed that there was a disgruntled employee with the intent to cause mass illness, and this would be accomplished by intentionally introducing biological agents to contaminate the food supply. And lastly, the specific biological agents used in this scenario were fungi that produce something called aflatoxins. Now, I want to take just a couple minutes to talk more about the agents being used in this assumption, just so you can fully understand the possible magnitude of these events. So what are aflatoxins? Well, they are a family of poisonous chemicals produced by certain fungi found on agricultural crops. This can include crops such as corn, wheat, peanuts, rice, and many others. Also, they can contaminate crops when they are being grown in the field by farmers, at harvest, or during storage. So there are a lot of opportunities along the supply chain for contamination. Another reason why they are dangerous is because they are colorless, odorless, and tasteless, which makes them difficult to detect and remove. There's also a history of outbreaks, and I wanted to highlight 3 interesting facts that I discovered in my research. So first, 25% of the world's food crop contamination can be attributed to these aflatoxins. Also, in 1974, there was a 2-month-long outbreak in India that caused an estimated 106 deaths. And then since 2004, there's been multiple outbreaks reported worldwide, resulting in 500 acute illnesses and estimated to be 200 deaths. So in addition to the health impacts, outbreaks can negatively affect the economy as well. An example of this was seen from an outbreak in 1996 that occurred in Arizona, which cost an estimated $45 million to control and reduced exports by 250 million. So moving on to 2 possible scenarios of how the disgruntled employee could intentionally contaminate the food supply. One thing the employee could do is intentionally alter the temperature and humidity settings in the grain storage vessels to create the optimal environment for fungi producing the aflatoxins. Another thing the employee could do is intentionally mix infected grain shipments with healthy grain shipments when they arrive at the grain elevator facility. So the next step in the analysis was to understand the food supply chain in this scenario. So I have 2 graphics here that helped with this. First on the left is a pretty cool diagram that shows the first 4 steps of how wheat travels from farm to table. So keep in mind in this scenario, I was analyzing the vulnerabilities that might exist in steps 2 and steps 3 related to the storing of grain and processing the grain to be shipped out to other parties. The graphic on the right explains, again, just how dangerous aflatoxins can be. On one hand, they can be passed directly to humans when they consume infected foods. On the other hand, they can infect animals, which then gets passed on to humans through the products such as eggs and milk. All right, so now we move on to the scoring part of the analysis, and the first attribute to be scored is criticality. And given the scenario and assumptions, this was scored as an 8, primarily based on data from historical outbreaks as well as the size of the global wheat industry. It's less than $100 billion, including the value of US wheat exports, which is estimated to be about $6 to $7 billion. The next attribute is accessibility, which was scored as a 9. It received this high score because the disgruntled employee is an insider with direct access to both the facility and the target. Also, security might not always be the tightest at grain elevator facilities, especially in rural communities. The next attribute is recuperability, which received a score of 3. This was assigned based on the data retrieved regarding those prior outbreaks that occurred in the past. And all the ones that were researched were resolved within 3 months at the most. Then we move on to scoring vulnerability, which was given an 8. This is because the target is constantly being handled, processed, or stored, which provides numerous opportunities for contamination along that supply chain, especially if it is intentionally attacked by an insider. Moving on to the effect, which was scored as a 2. The bad news here is that the opportunity exists to impact an entire facility for sure. However, there are normally many facilities producing the same product, so this greatly reduces the chances of a large-scale impact, especially considering this scenario where it's just one disgruntled inside employee. The next attribute analyzed was recognizability. This was assigned a 9 because grain, right, as well as the grain facilities and locations are easily recognizable, especially again, considering the scenario assumed here, where it's an insider threat within the facility. The last attribute of the analysis is the shock. This received an 8, again, somewhat based on historical data from prior outbreaks, but also in general, any attack on the food supply can cause loss of life, substantial economic impacts, and degrading public trust or morale. So since the Carver plus shock method assists with identifying vulnerabilities and analyzing the target, the question arises, what can we do or what countermeasures should we consider? Well, one thing that should be discussed is the amount of management oversight that may be needed to be increased. Second, the organization could implement what's called an employee peer monitoring program, which would include things like questioning peers that are found in areas not associated with their job function, as well as teaming individuals together to provide dual control during critical processes. In addition, having the analysis and testing performed by more than one individual would improve the quality control process and reduce the amount of risk posed by just a single person doing that process. And lastly, the organization could also take some of the human element out of it just by designing or purchasing new equipment that would prevent tampering with the temperature and humidity settings in the storage vessels. So that brings us to the end with a thanks to the references listed on the slide here. So thank you everyone for listening to this presentation, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks.